Welcome to another video from Demystifying Proposals. Our mission is to break down the proposal process and make proposals make sense. In this video, we touch on compliance, a step-by-step detailed process view of how to make sure your proposal is compliant. If you learned something from this video, please hit the thumbs up to like the video. Subscribe to our channel and click on the bell to be notified of future videos. If you'd like, leave a comment. The basics. The basics of how to ensure compliance include shredding the RFP for the proposal instructions. You need to look for what your pages are limited to overall and the number of pages per section. Sometimes the RFP instructions tell you how many pages for the technical approach, the management approach, etc. You need to check for your font size. Often tables and graphics can use a smaller size. If this isn't the case in the RFP, think about asking a question. And then also pay attention to your font type. A lot of federal proposals require Times New Roman. Sans serif fonts generally use less space. So again, think about asking a question. And then the other thing you need to do is understand the evaluation criteria. Are proposals being evaluated using adjectival ratings only? Then the proposal instructions are even more critical to compliance. The first step in compliance is developing your proposal outline. Here we show a table of the typical federal RFP sections. The sections in red are the ones that the proposal team will focus on the most. Section C, or the statement of work or the performance work statement. Section L, which is the instructions to offerers, sometimes called also proposal instructions. And Section M, the evaluation criteria, or how the proposal will be evaluated by the government. The structure of the proposal outline, or the compliance matrix, starts with Section L, and then Section M is filtered in, and then Section C, which identifies the work to be done, is added in the appropriate section. Discrepancies between Section L and M must be addressed, as both must be included. So if there's something in Section M that isn't included in Section L, you need to find an appropriate place in your outline to include it. It's also important to look in Section H for any key personnel requirements. And don't forget to look at Section B, which is usually the CLIN structure and tells you the kind of contract, cost plus or T&M, and that may be a factor in your management volume or other sections of the proposal. Not all proposals will have something called Section L or M and C. Some customers have their own numbering structure or naming convention. The Department of Homeland Security, for example, does this. They number their RFPs instead of using letters. But there's almost always something called proposal instructions or instructions to offerers or something along those lines that has the instructions for fonts and the numbers of pages and all of those factors that you have to take into account in your outline. There's always something that tells you how the proposal will be evaluated, whether that's tables of excellent, very good, good, poor, and unacceptable, or very relevant, relevant, somewhat relevant, and not relevant. This is the equivalent of Section M. RFPs also usually include a section telling you what work the government is asking you to do. That's the statement of work or the performance work statement. And for IDIQs, this may be only very high level information, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have to be addressed. It still needs to be addressed. So we recommend that you always start with a proposal template. Most companies have a proposal template that matches their brand. So be sure to use yours and follow the style guidance included in the template in terms of fonts and colors, etc., making sure that everything is compliant with what the RFP is requiring, of course. Cover pages often have to include specific information from the proposal instructions. So make sure you pay attention to this when you're building your proposal template. The cover pages also usually includes the FAR disclosure statement written below. This is straight out of the FAR and doesn't need to be modified in any way, but can be modified if you need to. So if you're responding to an RFI, for example, you might change that to say this response to the request for information, etc. So you can use this same disclosure statement on multiple kinds of documents. It's for wherever you want to protect your information. You want to include the RFP information on every page, usually in the header. The name of the RFP, the volume name, and be sure to use whatever language the RFP uses. So if they call it the business volume, call it the business volume. If they call it the pricing volume, call it the pricing volume. Same thing with whether they use proposal or they use volume. And then the RFP number exactly as the government has put it in the RFP. So if there's not a number sign in front of it, don't add it. Then include the proposal due date. That's usually in the footer. You may have to change that later, of course, if you get an extension. The footer should also include the language from the FAR that goes with the disclosure statement, which is use or disclosure of the data on this page is subject to the restriction on the cover page of the proposal. So you put your disclosure statement on the cover page, and then in the footer of every subsequent page, you put that language from the FAR. Now we're going to talk about the outline for the technical volume. First thing you want to do when you're setting up your technical volume outline is to map your section L proposal instructions to the level 1 headings, exactly as they are found in section L. So in this example, the first section in section L that they are asking us to use is technical approach. So 1.0 is technical approach. And then in the brackets behind that, you put the exact RFP reference information. So here it's section L. First section of section L is 1, and then the first bullet underneath that is section A. Now, if they don't use A, if it's just bullets, then just leave it at section L1. What you're trying to do here is guide the evaluators to understand exactly what information is going to be in that section. So technical approach is going to have all of the information that they've asked you to provide in RFP section L1A. Then you would put in your other sections. So that might be management approach, that might be past performance. You want to put them in exactly the same order as they are required in section L. So sometimes the management approach is the most important thing, and they put that first. Then management approach would be your first section, 1.0 management approach, instead of technical approach as is shown here. Next, you want to break down the section L sections. So the technical approach usually has more than one subsection in section L. Same with the management approach. You want to keep the subsections in the same order as they are in the RFP. Do not rearrange the sections to, quote, tell a better story. Assume the evaluators will have a list in front of them that is in the same order, and your proposal should be in exactly the same order as they're expecting to see it. Now we're going to map in section M, or the evaluation criteria. In a perfect world, the RFP will have the same sections for section M, or the evaluation criteria, as it did for section L, the proposal instructions. If it doesn't, you have to figure out how to add anything new. So try and find a section of section M that is relevant to whatever the additional information in the evaluation criteria and add it there. If there isn't one, then just make up a section within the section L structure that adds the section M. Be sure and use those brackets I talked about before so that it's very clear what section that refers to. Also note that the order in section L takes precedence over the order in section M. So if, for example, in section L, it says technical approach, management approach, past performance, and in section M, it says management approach, technical approach, past performance, section L rules. So you should put it in the same order as section L. Then you want to add the section M references to the brackets. So from the previous example, we had section 1.0, technical approach, RFP section L1A. Now we're going to add M2A because that's the RFP reference for section M. Next, you want to break down the M sections. So again, the technical approach may have more than one section in section M. Hopefully, they're the same as you had in section L. And so all you have to do is add the M references in the brackets because the names would be the same. But if not, you need to add anything from section M that is not in section L. The same is true from your management approach. And again, do not rearrange the order of the sections. Assume the evaluators have a list in front of them that's in that same order. Next, you need to figure out where you're going to address the statement of work or performance work statement. Usually there's an instruction for, quote, describe your approach to the statement of work in one of the subsections of the technical approach. It's often the first subsection of the technical approach, but it's not always. Put the statement of work or the performance work statement sections of section C in exactly where section L tells you to put them. You also want to, as you did with section L and section M, keep the statement of work tasks in the same order as they are in the statement of work in the RFP. Again, do not try and, quote, tell a better story. Then you want to add the section C references to the name in the header in the brackets after the section L and M citations. Again, we are trying to help the evaluators understand exactly what that section will include. So, for example, if the first section of your statement of work is task 1 program management, which it often is, then you would put the L and M references in for technical approach. So L1A is technical approach, M2A is also technical approach, and then you add SOW section 6.1, as in the example of the task 1 program management can be found in the statement of work section 6.1. We recommend keeping the L&M references for the SOW subsections, just to make it super clear to the evaluators that you're responding to those sections, as well as the statement of work and the PWS. However, as a caveat to that, if you get tight on page space, sometimes taking the L&M references out and making your header shorter so that they don't wrap to a second line, for example, is a way to get more pages back. And in that case, we would recommend that you keep the statement of work language in the brackets, but maybe not the L&M references. Most proposals will have appendices. These are often the resumes or the letters of commitment. There are other things that might be in an appendix. Sometimes there are draft plans, for example, like a transition in plan or transition out plan, a quality management plan. Again, put the appendices in the same order as listed in the RFP. So it might be Appendix A is your transition in plan, Appendix B is your transition out plan, but make sure that everything is really clear. Again, use those brackets in the headers, make it really super easy for the evaluators. The final step in developing your proposal outline is to assign page limits for each section and subsection. I usually put these in parentheses after the section L, M, and C references in the heading. So as an example here, 1.0 technical approach, RFP section L1A, M2A, you'll remember those, we've used those before, and that section is limited to 10 pages. Usually the technical approach gets the bulk of the page limit as it includes the information that you have to respond to the statement of work and the performance work statement, section C. However, be sure to take into account the evaluation criteria. So if management is the most important factor, consider giving more page count to that section than you usually would, because clearly it's the most important to the government. If the evaluation criteria lists the sections, quote, in order of importance, then use that as your guide for page allocations. The most important section gets the highest number of pages. Don't forget to assign page limits to all sections and subsections. So within the technical approach, for example, the overall section might be limited to 10 pages, but within it, how are you allocating those 10 pages? So using the same example as we had before, task 1, program management, we're assigning a page and a half to that section. That doesn't mean that it's a page and a half on top of the additional 10 pages. It's a page and a half within the 10 pages of the technical approach. Then do the same for the management approach, which often has several subsections as well. So key personnel, staffing plan, non-key personnel. Again, you want to assign the page limits based on how important each section is to the overall proposal evaluation. So for example, your statement of work section in the technical approach usually has the most pages allocated, as I said before. And then within that statement of work, what are the most important tasks? What tasks have the most pages in the RFP? Consider these as you allocate pages for the subsections. And then past performance is usually already page limited in the proposal instructions. Often you're only allowed 2 or 3 pages per citation. Be sure to note also things that are not included in the page count, such as resumes and letters of commitment. So if, for example, you include your resumes within the body of the proposal and not in an appendix, then make sure that in the heading for each resume, you note that that page count doesn't count against the page count of the overall proposal. And then also make sure when you're evaluating how close you are to the page limit, that you don't count those pages against your page limit. So these are all the things that are super important when you're thinking about your page limitations for your proposal. Now we're going to talk about the cost volume, also sometimes called the business volume or the pricing volume. For the cost volume, you want to do basically the same thing as you did for the technical. You're going to follow the instructions in section L and make sure that all of your level 1 headings match the proposal instructions. So that section L1, if that's what the requirement is contract line item numbers, for example, then section 1 of your proposal should also be CLINs. If section 2 is where they want to see your price and schedule, then make sure that section 2 of your proposal is your price schedule. So again, you want to keep things in the same order, always make it as easy for the evaluators as possible. And then just like we did for the technical volume, we're going to map in the section M requirements, and we're going to update the bracketed information behind each of the headers to show how it maps to the evaluation criteria, just like we did for the proposal instructions. Unlike the technical volume, the cost volumes are usually not page limited. So you don't usually need to add page limits to the section, but in the rare instance where there are page limits, be sure to note them in the proposal outline. Next, we're going to look at the past performance volume or section. Sometimes the past performance is its own volume, and sometimes it's just part of the technical volume. When you put in your past performance citations, make sure that the project name is exactly the same as that on the CPARs and the contracts documents. Often you have an internal shorthand for what you call a project, and that may be what the authors use, but when the proposal is built, you want to make sure that you use exactly the same language as the government will be expecting to see. So use the same project name as they use on their evaluations, like the CPARs. Because the government has the right, and often will, look up the CPARs and look up the FPDS information. And if your past performance citation doesn't match, they may ding you. So if you want to use a shorthand because the full name is long, then treat it like an acronym and define the first name on first use, and then define the shorthand in parentheses after the full contract name. And then you can use the shorthand from there. Also, make sure that the contract number is correct. Even if they didn't ask for it, if the contract is a task order under an IDIQ or a GWAC, then include that as part of the contract number. So you would have two numbers. The first number would be whatever the IDIQ is or whatever the GWAC is. And then usually we use a slash and you put in the contract number for the particular project after that. Also, make sure the contract value is correct. Again, remember that the technical evaluation panel, the evaluators, the TEP, has access to FPDS. They can, and sometimes do, confirm that the values match. These are not really compliance issues, but they will irritate the TEP if they're wrong. A few other notes on past performance citations. You want to make sure that you make the past performance citations consistent amongst themselves. So you can either use the full contract value, $1,234,456, or you can use 1.2 million, or you can use 1 million, but be consistent in each of your citations. If it's important that the value be of a certain size, then think about that when you contract the value, because that may not show the information that you need in order to be compliant. Same thing for phone numbers, whether you use the area code with a dash or the area code with parentheses, doesn't really make any difference, but make them consistent. This is just sort of to make things look clean and to make them look nice. It's not a compliance issue, it's just a good practice. Same thing for dates, right? So you can do 5/5/2005, or you can do 5/5/05, or you can do 05/05/2005. Doesn't make any difference, just make them consistent. Same for city and state, same for people's names. So Mr. Johnson or Andrew Johnson or Mr. Andrew Johnson. Generally, I just use the first name and the last name, except for military ranks. Then it's very important that you use the appropriate military rank, spelled correctly or abbreviated correctly, particularly if you're proposing to the Department of Defense or the Department of Homeland Security. So for the technical volume, you have what I call compliance level 2, which is internal compliance. True compliance doesn't stop at the section headings of the outline. That's level 1 compliance, setting up the outline based on the overall section headings in sections L, M, and C. But there's also something we call internal compliance, and that means breaking down the sections into their component parts. So most proposal instructions and evaluation criteria include sentences or phrases of what technical approach or management approach means. And those should be your next level headings if they don't break them down for you in the section L and M. So for example, the staffing plan might say, quote, offerers should explain their staffing levels, how the staff proposed meet the requirements, and how staffing levels were determined. So under your staffing plan heading, the subheadings would be staffing levels, how staff meet requirements, how staffing levels were determined, so that you are very clear in your headings and your subheadings how you are providing exactly the information that they're asking for. So breaking that example down even further, your staffing levels, RFP section L1B1, right? Because that's the first subsection of that section of management. So you add that .1 to indicate that it's the section of the RFP that goes one level down. Again, if they don't actually number that instruction, then don't put a number in. But if they do number it, put the number in. So then they're going to ask you in that section sometimes, what does staffing look like? So that might be most easily addressed as a table. But for compliance, be sure that whatever you say in your technical approach matches what ends up in the cost volume. So in the cost volume, they're going to be looking at price to win. And price to win may end up changing the staffing levels during proposal development. They may decrease the number of staff in a particular LCAT, or they may increase the staff in a particular LCAT, or they may change what the LCATs are from, say, senior level positions to just those positions or lower level positions. So make sure as a final check at the ripe of, usually during white glove or maybe even gold team, that the staffing levels reflected in the technical approach are the same as the staffing levels in the cost volume. So then in the next section, how the staff meet the requirements, again, add that number 2 if that's how the RFP labels that section. And then you want to maybe consider this, asking a question to narrow this to the key personnel. Because if you have to talk about how all your staff meet the requirements, that could get into a lot of detail and a lot of pages that you probably don't have. And most of the time, the government is really only interested in the key personnel. Sometimes they're interested in everybody. So it's actually worth asking that question. So again, often complying with this requirement uses a table that maps the labor category requirements, the LCATs, and the section C or section K requirements that often, that's where other places where they have requirements for your key personnel to show how your personnel have that experience or those capabilities. So you may, for example, for the program manager, you have the name in the far left column. Then you have their title, program manager, project manager, whatever the RFP calls that person. And then in section C, that may require them to have a PMP, for example, and you would say PMP. And then if section K or section H, whichever has the key personnel requirements, has additional requirements, then you want to make sure that you include all of that information in your table. It's a very easy way to show that your staff meet the requirements. Then finally, you have to make sure that whatever you say in that table or whatever you say in this section, the resumes reflect the exact same information. So people don't always have all the information on their resumes that might be included here. Make sure that you update the resumes with any information that you need to show how the staff meet the requirements, both in the section here, so the technical approach or the management approach, or also in the resumes. And then do that cross check, just like you did with the cost volume. And then how staffing levels were determined. So that might be the next section of the management. So there you want to talk about how did you determine what staff the program or project will need? Did you develop a work breakdown structure? Did you do a comparison to another analogous program? How did you determine your staffing levels? Again, whatever you put here needs to be reflected in the cost volume, or whatever's in the cost volume needs to be reflected here. So here I'm talking about an instance where the evaluation criteria did not exactly match what the proposal instructions criteria were. So in a perfect world, those two things match, right? In a perfect world, in section L, they ask you to talk about section staffing levels. And in the evaluation criteria, they also ask you to talk about staffing levels. But if they don't match exactly, then you're going to have to add in the section M requirements that are in addition. So in this case, we had an RFP that asked for proposed additional staff. So in addition to the key personnel, they wanted you to talk about the additional staff. That was an M only requirement. So you'll notice the bracket only refers to the M section where that information was required. This is again where those parenthetical references to sections L, M, and C come in really handy to show compliance. So internal compliance can get really fun when it comes to the statement of work or the PWS requirements, because as you did with the proposal instructions and the evaluation criteria, so you now must do with the statement of work and the PWS task, right? The top level headings in this part of your outline should be exactly the same as those in section C, in the same order as section C. Don't rearrange things. And then within each task, if you have room, include the subsections as well. So this depends on what your page limits are, whether you can break down the tasks. But if you can, it's a really good way to show, again, compliance. So within program management, the first three things they asked us for in this example were a kickoff meeting, monthly status reports, and quarterly meetings. So our subsections of program management level 1.0 were 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, quarterly meetings, monthly status reports, kickoff meeting. Where this gets really tricky is if the subtasks are extensive and your page limits are minimal. So that's a place where you might consider a features and benefits table or some other kind of table where you include the subtasks in one column, what you're going to do, the features in the second column, and then a third column that would be benefits of how you're doing the work that are benefits to the customer. So that's a good way to address a lot of subtasks in a relatively small number of pages when your page limits are particularly tight. I've already mentioned this a couple of times, but one of the things you need to make sure is that you do inter-volume compliance. So particularly for the technical volume versus the cost volume, these are some things that you need to check for compliance purposes. So during the course of proposal development, the staffing may have changed. Make sure that whatever is in the cost volume reflecting the cost that you're proposing is what's reflected in the technical volume. Same thing for the levels of staff. Again, you may have fewer senior people if you needed to bring your price down, or you may have changed the kind of people who are doing the work to a less expensive labor category. Again, make sure that that's all reflected in your technical volume. Again, another thing that might have changed is the number of iterations on a solution. So what's in your work breakdown structure may have changed the number of iterations in order, again, for that price to win to be met. Make sure that whatever in your proposal on the technical volume side reflects that same information. So as a last check the staffing in the technical volume against the staffing in the cost volume. check the staffing and the cost volume narrative against the cost volume spreadsheet. So the cost volume spreadsheet is usually incorporated in the cost volume, but if it's not, you still need to check it so that what it says in that volume spreadsheet matches what it says in the narrative. And then check the level of the staff matches, and then check whatever else you did in order to get to the price to win, and make sure that all of those puts and takes are reflected in your technical volume. So as we talked about before, the past performance volume should reflect the contract names as they were awarded, the customers' names, the contract names, the period of performance. All of these should have been checked for the past performance volume. But you also need to make sure that you check the information in the technical volume. Again, most companies have a shorthand for the projects, so they don't use the full name of the projects. You need to make sure that in the technical volume and possibly the cost volume, you use the same information that you used in the past performance volume of the contract name, at least in the first instance. If you want to use a shorthand version, then again, like you would an acronym, define the shorthand name in parentheses after the name of the project is spelled out completely the first time. Then you can use the shorthand name from there. I hope you enjoyed this video from Demystifying Proposals. Please leave a comment if you have any questions or you think there's additional information that needs to be added, and we will consider updates as appropriate. Thank you for your time.